G'day everyone. Welcome to our ongoing webinar series, Unparliamentary, where we discuss the latest that's happening in federal politics with one of our panel of guest journalists. This week, we're obviously joined by Paul Bongiorno. Thanks for joining us, Paul.
Hi there, everybody.
A couple of things to get us started to make sure that this runs nice and smoothly. So I want to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. A reminder that you can register for all our other upcoming webinars and Australia's biggest book club webinars on our website at australiainstitute.org.au. And a couple of Zoom tips: you can type in questions for Paul into the Q&A box in Zoom. You should also be able to upvote other people's questions and leave comments on them as well. A reminder to please keep things civil and on topic in the chat or we'll boot you out. And lastly, a reminder that this discussion is live but is being recorded and it will go up on our YouTube channel later this afternoon. This week, as I mentioned, we are joined by Paul Bongiorno, columnist for the Saturday paper and the New Daily and a 30-year veteran of the Canberra Press Gallery. We're so delighted to have you again. And a lot has happened it's been 4 weeks since we've done one of these. We had a bit of a break, but as always, a lot happening in federal politics. Yep. We've got a significant escalation of hostilities in the Middle East as the Israel-Gaza war has expanded into Lebanon. The conflict is having serious implications here in Australia with community tensions rising, the political tone souring. I'd also like for us to talk about the 1 year anniversary since the Voice referendum. And we've got 2 state elections this month in the ACT here where we are and in Queensland as well. And today news that the Prime Minister has bought himself a $4.3 million oceanfront home, also making headlines. So a lot to get to as usual. Thanks so much for joining us, Paul.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So I want to start with, I think, kind of the heaviest and most serious topics before we get into local politics, which is the escalating crisis in the Middle East. Obviously, extremely concerning. Lots of deaths of civilians in both Lebanon now and obviously in Gaza in particular. A ceasefire really seems a long way off. And now it's beginning to impact, I think, in Australian politics. But where do you see this at the moment in the context of Australian politics, this conflict?
Well, there's no doubt that that the conflict in the Middle East is causing great pain for a lot of people in Australia. I think the estimate is that 10% of Australians are very exercised because they have relatives either in Gaza or Palestine or in Israel, and so it's a very personal involvement that they have. But I think tensions are also raised by the fact that the daily horrors that we're seeing on our TV news has confronted people, especially the images of children of bombed out buildings and all of this thing continuing all the time, which I think affronts people's sensibilities in its own right. But I think another thing that's happened with it is the war in the Middle East has become part of the culture war between the left and the right of politics. And I think this came to a big head last week in the Federal Parliament on the anniversary of the October 7 Hamas attacks, when the federal opposition refused point blank to support a motion that the Prime Minister put up that expressed sympathy not only for the Israelis who lost their lives and who were taken hostage and who were badly injured, but also extended the sympathy to the 40,000 plus. I mean, these days that's considered a minimal view of the death toll in Gaza alone, but also, as we saw last week, extending into Lebanon, now hitting, several thousand, if not more. And of course, overhanging it all is the prospect of Iran, coming back into the fray. So Peter Dutton has been uncompromising in his support of Israel. He rarely, if ever, expresses any sympathy for the Palestinians or any condemnation of what even the international court, as far says there's more than prima facie evidence that Israel is breaking international law. Never pays any attention to that, but attacks the Albanese government, and did this in the parliamentary debate last week for speaking out of both sides of its mouth, by wanting to have sympathy for the victims on the Palestinian side as well as the Israeli side, and for calling for a ceasefire. In fact, on the weekend, we saw James Patterson, the Shadow Home Affairs Minister, when he was tackled about the fact that the opposition was not agreeing with the government on a call for a ceasefire, but that the Biden administration still called for a ceasefire, even though it understood why Israel was going into Lebanon to try and clean up the Hezbollah. Patterson made the quite amazing or novel, really, admission that the opposition, having previously criticised the Labor government for being out of touch with our major allies, said, "Oh well, it's a centre-left government in Washington, and I'm a centre-right politician. Of course, we're going to disagree," which undercut the whole argument that Dutton's been making, that the Albanese government's stance is out of tune with our major partners and allies. It's now emerged beyond reasonable doubt, Your Worship, that it's the Dutton opposition that's out of tune with the United States and our major allies in Britain and in Europe on the response to the war, that people realise that the hostilities cannot go on. I read in Haaretz, which is an independent journal of some note in Jerusalem, which says that there is criticism in Israel of the Netanyahu government's determination of an unending war to absolutely root out Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis, all of these proxies of Iran, no matter where they are and no matter what the cost. Interestingly, in Haaretz yesterday, there was an opinion piece by Gideon Levy that said that this cannot go on without bloodshed and heartache, not only for the Palestinians and the Arabs, but also for Israelis themselves. And we're seeing already that the Israeli population is itself terrified. And just today, the Australian government has warned in its travel advice that no one should go to Israel, and Australians in Israel should come home.
I mean, the death toll of civilians has been just awful. And as you said, primarily in Gaza. But we hear again and again, obviously, this idea that Israel is doing its best to avoid civilian casualties, but its best really isn't very good. There's tens of thousands of people have now been killed. And the other escalation that really concerned me was the explosion of those devices that I'm not sure that they've taken responsibility for. But regardless of who did it, that seemed to be, again, a bit like drones, like another kind of a thing that really has that impact to indiscriminately kill civilians in a way that we haven't seen before. And I think marked another new and alarming kind of chapter in that conflict. But I guess how is the government responding at the moment to this, and how are the Australian people responding to how the government is handling it? Because as you said, there's a lot of people who have loved ones or family or friends in all of these countries, and Peter Dutton is obviously very much playing the domestic politics of this with that really hardline stance to only back Israel.
Well, there are some indications that his stand is misfiring, that it's not exactly working. For example, the Essential poll last week found 56% of Australians, now this coincided with the debate in the Parliament, 56% of Australians are satisfied with the Albanese government's response to the Israel-Gaza war. And there was a separate poll in the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, which found that 51% of Australians don't want the government to take sides in the conflict. And interestingly, they don't see this conflict as the sort of threat to Australia that we should get involved in militarily. For example, 67% surveyed by Resolve don't want any form of military involvement, either sending military equipment, 67% were against that, or sending military support, soldiers, 72% were against that. Now, some might say and point to the news poll this week. So it's the first news poll Labor has lost since 2020, and it undercuts Albanese's statement in September that he's the only government for some time that's never lost a news poll. It's a bit like Malcolm Turnbull and the 30 news polls that Tony Abbott lost. You should be careful about some of the claims you're making. But the news poll by a smidgen, 51 to 49, rounding out, put the coalition ahead for the first time. The primary votes for both hadn't changed, but there was a shift in the minor parties, which led to the way the
two-party
preferences
preferred.
were allocated. Now, Kevin Bonham, an analyst, says that it's a bit overblown what this actually means, because basically since the failure of the voice referendum, Labor's been sliding, and the opposition Labor have been, pretty well neck and neck for months. But Bonham did some, maybe to calm the nerves of some of those who think that Dutton's about to win the election. Not only did Bonham say, well, not the first government, to be behind during a term in news poll only to go on and win an election. But also people made a lot of the fact that Albanese now for the first time is as equally unpopular or disapproved, if you want to be a bit technical, as Peter Dutton. He minus 14, net minus. So in other words, more people don't like him than like him, or approve than do. And same with Dutton, minus 14. Now, Bonham did some homework, and he's come up with 3 prime ministers who had worse approvals, who went on to win the election. Hawke, we forget this. Hawke had a net rating of minus 25 and he won an election. Keating minus 44 and he famously won that election.
To overcome.
And Howard on 2 occasions, right? He was minus 31. So it was a long way down the tube from where Albanese is at the moment, minus 31. And then Howard minus 36 on another occasion. So look, one government insider said to me, look, one of the problems governments have is governments get blamed for everything,
Yeah.
And in a sense, that's right, because if anything goes right, they claim credit for it. So when things are going bad, they've got to wear it. So the test now is going to be well, does Albanese have what it takes, given that he's not as far behind as some of his predecessors were, to go on to win like Hawke, Keating and Howard did? And some in the Labor party are a bit worried that maybe he doesn't. They think that maybe he hasn't got the touch that he needs, whereas others think that these are just nervous Nellies. And one said, look, don't take too much notice, quote, of the bedwetters. So I think that there's a bit of perspective there. And whether it's the response to the war in Gaza or not is, I think, not really relevant. I think all the polls point to, and the other polls this week on housing affordability, basically it's the cost of living struggles, it's the housing crisis, it's the rental crisis. All of these things, I think, are playing much more relevantly into how the parties are travelling. And in fact, it was put to me, which I wrote in the Saturday paper on the weekend, it was put to me that Peter Dutton's in grave danger, if he hasn't already done it, of making this, or creating the same perception that Albanese did with The Voice, that he was concentrating on something that a majority of the Australian electorate didn't think was their top of mind issue or worry.
Yeah. No, I can see that. And speaking of, I guess the Voice last year, it's the 1 year anniversary since the Voice referendum, and we've seen some reflections on the lack of success of that campaign, and particularly how the yes and no campaigns were executed. A year on, what impact has this had on the project of reconciliation, would you say?
Well, it's been a disaster for reconciliation, and it's taken a toll of Albanese and the government. So there's two big losses there. Excuse me. It's all the pollen in the air.
Can't escape it.
Anyway, so let's talk about reconciliation. There is no doubt that when the 60-40 vote came in against, that not only did that narrow proposition of a voice to the parliament, that was the only thing we really asked in the constitution, that's what went down, but the broader politics of reconciliation was lost, so much so that we now have the opposition has no compunction in just burying the whole thing, not talking about another recognition referendum or anything like that.
Yeah, they dumped that pretty quickly.
That's all dumped. We don't need any of that. And you have Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa Price, the Nationals, the spokesperson on Indigenous affairs, saying, well, the government's dropped everything and it doesn't want to do anything, which is actually not correct. And I noticed that Melandiri McCarthy Minister points out that the Albanese government is still pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into Aboriginal programs in an attempt to, close the gap. And also at the state level, there are programs and moves underfoot on truth-telling, perhaps even leading to some sort of state-based treaties. But at the national level, it does seem that loss has badly spooked the way in which
technical difficulty here. Just checking if people can see me. Hi guys, just checking. Can you indicate to me in the chat if we are back on? It looked to me like we lost our connection there. Yeah, I can see a couple of people can hear us. I'm really sorry about that. I'm not sure what has happened with that this morning, so we might have just lost the end of Paul's last response there. My apologies for the technical difficulties. I hope it doesn't happen again. We'll try and sort out what those difficulties are. But if I can just, I guess, reiterate what we were talking about with the repercussions of the voice there. And it's really kind of clawed back, I guess, ambition overall. But I guess in contrast to Peter Dutton's warnings about division, I feel like it really has played up those divisions in the community as well. And certainly First Nations communities, a lot of the reflections that I've been reading themselves are obviously feeling very rejected, and there's no real path forward in terms of a lot of those issues that were facing that community that they wanted the voice to help them solve, things like the health gap, the education gap, those kinds of things. Tell me a little bit more about what you were talking about with Malandiri McCarthy and the things that she's been talking about.
Well, the things that she's been talking about is that there are programs out there that they do have bodies set up that they do consult with. They are looking for voices. All these things are happening, but if you like, they're not being trumpeted. And I think that's unfortunate because it does show, as I was saying, a tentativeness that which is a direct result of the failure of the referendum on, well, if you listen to the opposition and Jacinta Price, maybe Warren Mundine, but more Jacinta Price, we're all equal, so why should anyone get special treatment?
Yeah.
So just on that, I believe the way forward now has got to be that Australians, from the moment they start school, right, have got to be taught the truth in the broad, the good and the bad and the ugly, and the beautiful of Australian colonial and pre-colonial history. Because a lot of Australians don't understand that the real point of the referendum was to redress an historic injustice, that there were people here that we dispossessed, that if you want to put it in plainer language, that there were people here who were robbed of their land, taken over without recompense, without recognition. I mean, it was so bad that these people weren't even considered to have been human, let alone have any claims. Terra nullius. No human being with any legal claim existed on the country. Well, all of this is a grave historic injustice that will not go away. And I suspect and hope that as the decades go forward and people are given a broader understanding of our Australian history, that they will want to redress that and see that there are Australians who have a special claim to our founding document and who are owed reconciliation and, in the broad, recompense.
Yeah. And I think that history still, we've got such a long way to go on that. For example, it was only recently I found out that where I grew up in Nowra and Bomaderry was kind of one of the sites where they sent the Stolen Generation. One of those notorious homes was in Bomaderry, and kind of a place that I had driven past on numerous occasions, just not knowing anything about that history of it. So it's all around us, and there's still a lot for people to learn about.
Well, just on that too,
Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the big lessons has got to be surely, and the 7 a.m. podcast has been doing in many ways, a gut-wrenching series this week on Alice Springs that goes down what we've got to learn from our failures, the Stolen Generation, and also the Northern Territory intervention, that paternalism is worse. It doesn't work. As if you can solve problems of domestic violence by sending the army in, for example, or by merely taking children out of dysfunctional relationships and families without trying to address the cause of the dysfunction, without trying to make sure that it doesn't keep on happening. I think that we've got to. We were thinking or beginning to think in those terms. We can't let the failure of the voice referendum stymie or bury a more sensible and a more humane and a more respectful approach.
Yeah. And indeed, as you say, like the evidence shows that where Aboriginal communities are involved and can help design some of those programs that are designed to reduce the gap, they have had great success. For example, if people can remember, during the pandemic, Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations had some of the best results on Earth, basically, for managing the pandemic for a long time. And they were doing that on the smell of an oily rag. So there's plenty of success stories to build on. I want to move now to the ACT and Queensland elections. And just a reminder, if you're watching us at the moment, you can type in a question for Paul in our Q&A box. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Here in the ACT, we've got I think some people have referred to it as a forever government, with Andrew Barr as Chief Minister for a long time now. Do you see any prospect of that changing in the ACT? Have you been following along here?
It's very interesting. Have you seen any opinion polls on it?
No, I haven't either. I was just thinking that. Yeah.
No, I haven't. But okay, so the Liberals, by their corflutes, have twigged to the idea that 23 years is a long time. So they're obviously hoping to work on the it's time factor. One thing about the ACT, however, it is an involved electorate. And I think that the Liberals have gone a long way with Elizabeth Lee as their new leader to come up and position the party in a way that would attract more support from the Canberra electorate. Like we see, for example, at the federal level, David Pocock, an independent, displaced Zed Seselja, and the more conservative Liberals that had taken over and still control, as far as I can work out, the Canberra Liberals. However, they've realised that they need to position themselves differently, and in Elizabeth Lee, they have an articulate proponent of what you might call, centre politics. I noticed that the Labor Party is so worried about it that they're even saying, oh, well, Elizabeth Lee might be okay, but look what the people behind her did when they voted against assisted dying, when they've got a hardline attitude on abortion, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Hoping to say to the electorate in broad, from Labor's point of view, don't be fooled. Elizabeth Lee, is still the leader of the old Liberal Party.
Yeah.
And she's gone a long way to say, well, she's leading a refurbished Liberal Party. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. There are independents running here, taking their leaf out of the Pocock book. Craig Emerson, the former Federal Labor Minister, his son is running as an independent. It'll be interesting to see how they go. The Greens did very well last time, forcing Labor into an alliance with them to govern. It'll be interesting to see if they can build on that. So maybe we end up with the Greens majority government, I did notice, by the way, that Elizabeth Lee didn't rule out governing with anybody, although she did say the anybody would have to be, in sympathy with where the Liberal Party wants to go. So, look, I think the balls are in the air, as they say. The last Liberal, Kate Cannell, and then Gary Humphries were the last Liberals to be Chief Minister, and they were definitely moderate Liberals.
Yeah.
And the party they led at the time, the Canberra Liberals, were definitely a moderate Liberal party.
Yeah.
So,
well, perhaps Elizabeth Lee is the start of moving back towards being moderate, but perhaps not quite there yet.
No, well, we'll see. Yeah.
But I think you're right about, it was very clear at the last couple of elections, I thought, that the Canberra Liberals had drifted very far away from where the Canberra community is. So at least, they've recognised that with the leadership. But in Queensland, it looks like Labor is headed to lose at this election after being in government for a long time. But Labor Premier Stephen Miles is throwing absolutely everything at this campaign. He's released a lot of what I would think very simple and popular policies that will probably resonate with a lot of people, like free school lunches would be one example. But a lot of things that are very practical, like taking over vacant hotels and apartment buildings and turning them into crisis and social housing and those kinds of things. But do you think it's going to be enough to shift the dial by the time they get to the election?
Oh, well, if you can believe the opinion polls and the ones over the last few years, actually, it's a very hard ask, and it'll be a boil over if he holds on. There's no doubt about that. Something in common, interestingly, between the embattled Queensland Premier and what Elizabeth Lee, the Liberal leader, is doing down here. They seem to be promising, popular policies like down here in Canberra, it's lower rates and all sorts of wonderful things, all sorts of new amenities and all the rest of it. And down here, the Chief Minister says, well, how are you going to pay for it? We'll find out later. Up in Queensland, you have a different sort of pitch to the argument, the main way in which the Miles Labor government is paying for anything is the fact that it upped mining royalties. And so, if you like, it's using the natural wealth of the state to bankroll what the citizens of the state need. And I think that's a very hard argument for, for the LNP up there to go against. Although I do notice that I think it's a school luncheon initiative. I think it was pointed out by the opposition up there that they're going into debt to pay that. But you'd have to say, looking at the windfall that they get from mining royalties, that it would be definitely a manageable debt.
Yeah.
But look, I do think that the indications are that the electorate has moved beyond that sort of thing and probably have taken the fact that Chris Afuli has gone out of his way not to scare the horses, and he's even matched some of Labor's more popular promises, like, for example, what is it, 50 cent
Public transport.
Public transport.
Yeah.
Even on the issue of abortion that flared last week, Chris Afuli has tried to dampen that down as well, although there's nothing he could do about, say, a Qatar party bringing up a private members bill on abortion and then demanding and getting, I presume, conscience votes. And I think there's a big difference now. For example, in the 80s, Premier Bjelke Petersen got his deputy, Liberal leader Bill Knox, to move or to bring forward into the parliament a stiffening of the criminalisation of abortion in Queensland. And it was a revolt in the National Party room then. There was the Nationals and the Liberals. It was a revolt in the National Party room then that forced it to be a private members bill, not a government bill, and forced it to be a conscience vote. And a significant number of the Nats and the Libs and Labor voted against that bill.
Yeah.
The indications are now, if an abortion bill came before the Queensland Parliament, that it's a very different LNP beast. The Christian right has got enormous influence in there, and as we saw when the abortion laws came up, when was it, last year? I think only 3 LNP people voted according to their conscience, and one of them was forced to quit.
Forced out.
Yeah. So maybe that's a real issue there. Maybe it isn't. But I think it, as a debate, it has some sort of a real relevance, especially for the women of Queensland.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in Queensland, it wasn't that long ago that they were prosecuting women for, they charged a young couple with trying to procure an abortion. That wasn't that long ago.
Precisely.
I do want to now move, I guess, to the news from today, and that Anthony Albanese has purchased a $4.3 million oceanfront home. Very lovely for him and his partner, Jody, who apparently is from the coast. So that's why they're purchasing it. But how do you think this is going to land politically, Paul?
Okay, well, look, there's no doubt the headline does look to be tin-eared in terms of a government facing a housing crisis, a rental crisis, an affordability crisis. People, there was even the Redbridge poll earlier in the week that showed there's enormous pessimism, with 75% of people, especially in regional and rural Australia, pessimistic that their children would ever be able to buy a house without help. So it's into that sort of political context that this news breaks. Now, Albanese today at a news conference pointed out that, yes, they've signed the contracts. It is on the Central Coast, but he's waiting on the sale of his house in Dulwich Hill before he can go ahead with it. And he will declare it. His focus isn't on buying this $4.3 million house, which, by the way, his real estate agent said he's got a bargain, because the sellers had it on the market for 4.6 and couldn't move it. Other people have pointed out what you get for 4.3 million on the Central Coast is a whole lot different to what you would get down in Sydney. I saw one comment earlier that And Tony Abbott and Peter Credlin, when Abbott was still in Malcolm Turnbull's on backbench, still in his government as a backbencher, they used to deride Malcolm Turnbull for his Point Piper mansion,
Mr.
Harbourside
Harbourside Mansion. I remember
Someone
that.
pointed out that would be worth probably around $40 million. It was
10
interesting.
times.
Yeah, well, it was interesting. Peter Dutton was asked about the Albanese purchase, and he actually congratulated Albo and Jody because they're getting married next year. And as you say, the reason for it was that she's a third generation Central Coaster and they'd like to live up there. So Dutton congratulated them and he said, look, but my more concern isn't about the Prime Minister and his fiancée, it's more about the people who can't afford to get into housing. And I think that Peter Dutton wisely didn't throw any more stones because only
He lives in a glass house.
he sold a Gold Coast property he owned for $6 million.
Yeah, and I think he's probably got many, many more properties on top of that, is my understanding as well. So, yeah, perhaps he knows he doesn't have a leg to stand on there. But as you mentioned a couple of times, cost of living really still is driving voter sentiment and the issues that they care about. And yeah, I think that one's got a long way to go. I think in your Saturday paper piece, you kind of, I think you mentioned the fact that, people obviously really care about this issue. It's one that really motivates a lot of voters, and that the Prime Minister had told his party room that they're going to go to the next election with some kind of big, bold ideas. So perhaps some additional measures on housing might be part of that. When are we expecting these big ideas to kind of start to be vented? Only when the campaign starts proper? Or soon, do you think?
Every other day we're hearing about cost of living relief, like the supermarkets last week. Then we've got today there's a talk of when you wear your debit card, that they'll outlaw the charges, the hidden charges for using the debit card. All of these things are happening along the way. There is, I think the government's holding its breath and fingers crossed on both hands that the Reserve Bank will finally start to lower interest rates, which will go a long way to maybe shift perceptions on if the crisis is finally being addressed. Of course, it's a dreadful issue politically because, as John Howard once remarked, he's never met anybody who complained to him as Prime Minister that the value of their house was going up. And a hell of a lot of people own houses, and one of the solutions to the housing crisis is for the value of houses to come down, The other
or even just stop growing as quickly as that, like that'd be a start.
Yeah. The other issue, of course, is housing supply. And look, the other thing that the strategists in the Labor Party are saying is that, look, as we get closer to the election, when push comes to shove, people say, well, look, we're not all that happy. We're a bit pessimistic, but what are the other side going to do to solve the problem and how, quickly? And we got a bit of an example today. Michael Sukkar, the opposition housing spokesman, was on Radio National. And in his interview, when Patricia Karvelas put that on him, he really had nothing to offer except that closer to the time you'll hear more from us. Certainly what they've put out there so far is all on the demand side, not on the supply side. And as we know, when you give people more money to buy houses, it tends to put the price of houses
pushes
up.
the price up.
It doesn't build any.
No, it certainly doesn't.
And it'll be interesting to see, just as Albanese surprised everybody with the stage 3 rejig, said, oh, it'll be political suicide, which it turned out not to be. Maybe they will revisit negative gearing and, more to the point, the capital gains tax discount, because the concessions as they stand do nothing to build new housing. It just it does a lot for investors to buy existing houses.
Yeah, it makes it much, much easier for someone to buy their second or third property than for someone to buy their first one as a first home buyer.
Yeah.
And I do think it shares some properties with the stage 3 tax cuts in when you look at them combined. The benefits of that are an effective cost to the budget of many, many billions of dollars
Yes.
each year, and primarily going to the people who need it least, to the people
Yep.
in, the top 10, 20% of income earners. So
Yeah, when you say all of that, probably in government, if you say, yes, we're going to do this, but we will grandfather it. So
yeah.
everybody that's got what they've got won't be taken away.
Or you can all have at least one investment property, but,
Or going
maybe we'll
forward,
restrict it after that, those kinds of
or
things.
that the concessions will be on new builds
Yeah.
rather than old builds.
Yeah, there's lots of ways that you could slice that, that would make it certainly fairer for a lot more people. We'll go now to questions from the audience. Just a reminder that if you've got a question for Paul Bongiorno, you can stick it in the Q&A box, and you can also upvote other people's questions and leave comments on them as well. So the first question that I've got is from Will Jones, who asks, how is it possible for the LNP opposition to be disingenuous on most issues and be 50-50 in the polls? I'm not sure that's necessarily a question that we can answer, Paul. And I'm not sure on what issues you might be referring to where you think the LNP is being disingenuous. But you kind of talked about that very slight shift in the polls. It is within the margin of error. But if I can, I guess, build on that question, I am curious. One thing is two-party preferred. Another is which seats the coalition might think would be the path towards government. They lost a huge number of their blue ribbon seats at the last election, but they don't seem to be the targets for the coalition at this election. They're kind of more going for those outer suburban seats. Is that your analysis?
Yeah, well, a couple of points to make. As I was saying earlier, governments tend to get blamed for everything, and people don't take a lot of notice of the opposition as such. So by default, an opposition, can benefit from that. And I think that that's an element in the polls. I don't think we should be shy and point out that the opposition gets enormous support from the Murdoch conglomerate. The headlines in the Courier Mail, the Daily Telegraph, the Herald Sun, the Advertiser are inevitably a negative to the government. This helps shape perceptions as well. Then what was that other point you just making? Oh, yes, the seats. Well, look, there is a belief, which I touched on, as you said last week, after Dutton's view or position that he's taken on Israel-Gaza, is there are 3 seats that could be in play there. There's Wentworth, which is in Sydney, which is the seat with the largest number of Jewish voters. Then in Melbourne, there's Kooyong now, which has folded into it many of the Jewish voters that were in the abolished seat of Higgins. And then there's McNamara, which has a big Jewish population held on a knife edge by Josh Burns, himself Jewish. Interestingly, there, Burns has told branch members that he's confident he can hang on, and some of his confidence is fed that a lot of the Jewish members in that inner Melbourne seat were in fact Green Jewish voters, and they've deserted the Greens. So that issue then may not play for Dutton in that seat as he might wish.
Yeah.
So there's 3 seats there. The other point is that, and this then comes down to what will Dutton do on housing. That Redbridge polling earlier in the week, which I think the Herald Sun in Melbourne ran as well, showing the pessimism, particularly in regional and outer suburban seats on housing, could cost Labor votes. But that may well then come when push comes to shove on what Dutton comes up with.
Yeah. The next question I've got is from Sophia McGrain, who says, would you agree that Labor's poor polling, despite lots of policies which benefit voters like childcare, wage rises, aged care reforms, super on parental leave, etc., is similar to Biden's poor polling prior to dropping out of the race due to voters not rewarding doing a good job? Perhaps tying into that, what you were saying, governments cop all the blame for things, even if they're
there's a couple of
doing
reflections I've been thinking about. That is, governments really get credit for what they deliver, really, and it a lot's got to do with the leader, and whether the leader excites the electorate, whether the leader is seen as, you know, someone that can push through and take us all with him. And what had happened to Biden in the end was Biden, and far be it from me to be ageist, given that I'm only a sapling here. Anyway, but Biden, unlike, for example, Trump, was beginning to look like a decrepit old man. You know, his shuffle, the way he was speaking, his lack of energy. And I think that this was sapping a lot of the support. And as we saw when Harris took over, perceptions quickly turned around. So there is that about it. And the fact of the matter is that Anthony Albanese has never really captured voters' imagination like a hawk did, you know, for example, or a Kevin Rudd. In many ways, he came to government not so much by default, but by the fact that by then the Liberals had been in power for 3 terms and Morrison was particularly on the nose. And it should be remembered that during the last election, when Albanese got COVID and people like Jason Clare and others took up the running, Labor's standing in rows. And
I've forgotten about that.
You know, I mean, the weights are on Albanese to lift his game and to do better this time. That's why I actually think the purchase of this property, even though it is a bargain and it's 4.3 million, like I know in my daughter's suburb in Sydney, quite ordinary houses are going for around 2 million. You say, what?
Yeah.
2 million? All of that, I still think that that Albanese showed a political tin ear at this time in purchasing that property, which is not the sort of thing that's needed if the election is going to go down to the wire.
Terence Hull, just again, kind of linking it to a potential Trump victory. Would a Trump victory in the United States have an influence on coalition strategies for next year's election in Australia?
Well, look, I think it would definitely embolden Peter Dutton to keep going down the path of Trumpism, where you, define reality in your terms only. And Dutton's done a lot of that, for example, as we saw on, the bold statements that Labor had lost its international standing because of the position it's taken on Gaza, whereas the position it's taken on Gaza is actually completely in line. He's the outlier, as increasingly so is the Netanyahu government. So there is that element. There's also, look, politicians have always gone for spin, but Dutton thinks nothing of making a statement that is, at face value wrong, if not true, and it does take a while to catch up with that. So Trump's and of course, all politicians look at what works, in democracies like our own, and the American democracy is somewhat like our own. But if Trump can make issues work in the way he has, it could well embolden our conservative parties in Australia to emulate it, which I think would be a very sad development.
Well, I kind of pick up, I was just thinking about the sad news that a lot of meteorologists in the United States are facing death threats for reporting on that most recent hurricane and what the severity of it might be. And I guess I'm seeing echoes there of the really concerted disinformation campaign we've seen against, for example, offshore wind, which apparently is some kind of threat to, whales, for example, that apparently offshore gas drilling is totally fine. So I do think we are seeing not just Trump tactics, but that issue of, I guess, disinformation and misinformation being able to spread really quickly and kind of poison the well on certain issues.
Well, an example of it too in our own 2019 bushfires, where the opposition was merely mouthed about whether climate change had anything to do with it, despite the fact of what the meteorologists and others were saying. And they were aided and abetted in a huge way by the Australian and the Murdoch conglomerate.
Yeah. The next question that I've got, and I might just get you to move a bit closer
Oh,
to your
yes,
mic
sure,
there, Paul,
sure.
please. Jill Newton asks, Paul, do you think there's any chance that Labor will shift on its wishy-washy gambling ad and environmental policies in accordance with its election policies before the end of its term?
That's a very good question. I saw one theory the other day that Albanese's hanging back, waiting for the argument to be so incontrovertible that he's got no way to go but a total ban, even though he's convinced at this stage that there's enormous pressure coming on him from, for example, the free-to-air television media and others that, or the major football codes, for example, that without the revenue from gambling, they'd all be struggling and, you know, would find it hard to keep existing. I mean, that argument has had some sway to this point of time with Albanese and the cabinet. And we saw, for example, even though he's retiring shortly, Bill Shorten has been, you know, very loud in pushing that view, and also, as Albanese does, pointing out that Albanese has done more to restrict gambling than any previous government. Yeah, okay, fine, but is it enough?
Yeah.
So I know there's a bit of frustration within the broader Labor Party that he should just make the decision. Okay, so if you think that you want to save the AFL and the NRL and junior sport and all the rest of it, okay, bring in more restrictions and then defend them, but don't keep us all hanging in limbo and you looking like you can't make a decision.
And it strikes me too that, like gambling is one thing, but the advertising of gambling, like kind of a separate thing in terms of being able to really target your policies at a
Mm.
specific area. And I'm sure all of the same arguments about no funding, would have happened when we really restricted tobacco advertising, for
Absolutely. Yeah,
example. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
Lynette Arden asks, would it be a tragedy if we're stuck with Dutton's policies on nuclear if he were voted in? Particularly if cost of living is still a big issue. Is there going to be much debate about either those nuclear policy issues or policies that take on global warming at this
Well,
election?
this is another example of what we were talking about before about Trumpism. I mean, Dutton gets up there and puts in the same breath cheaper electricity with nuclear. Well, when? That's the next point. I mean, on their own timetable, nuclear is 3 elections away, if ever, you know.
Yeah.
And the next thing is, on all the analysis that we've seen from reputable sources, the CSIRO and others, you know, anyone, specialists in energy, is that there is no way that it can be cheaper. And already we have from the Dutton opposition that they want the taxpayers to bankroll the nuclear because they know that it is not an attractive business proposition for private capital without massive government expenditure.
Mm.
Well, why would you go down that path when you have abundant wind and solar increasingly producing cheaper electricity and cheaper with battery technology, with pumped hydro and all that sort of thing, being able to give us what they're claiming for nuclear. And by the way, just going back on the Queensland election, it is a bit disturbing that the Queensland opposition is threatening to stop a major pumped hydro project in the far north of Queensland if it gets into power. And Chris Afuli is already talking about, because the state government up there owns all the coal-fired power stations, which Labor has been phasing out and building big wind farms and solar farms right next door to them. Well, Christopher Foley said, no, I'll make electricity cheaper by stopping all of that. So that to me, that will be quite a tragedy
Yeah.
when that happens.
Well, and it's also going to push electricity prices up
Well,
for
of course.
Queenslanders. People might not know this because it's not often what makes it into the news, but it is those aging coal-fired power stations. A lot of them are operating below their capacity when they come offline, which they do because a lot of them are aging and, are increasingly breaking down. They take out huge chunks of capacity from the electricity market, which pushes the prices up in the short term until they can come back on. And yeah, it really halting that transition will make all of those interventions even more expensive for consumers.
We've already lost 10 years for the climate wars. And there's another element which we didn't get to discussing, but just very briefly, if Israel attacks Iran's oil supplies, it'll knock out only 3% of world global supplies. But if Iran retaliates, as it's threatened to do, by then knocking out Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates oil supplies, we will get, and Alan Kohler wrote an analysis on this a couple of weeks ago, we will get an oil shock that will put the 1973 oil shock in the shade, and it will become a massive inflationary event worldwide, and it will redefine the whole argument over inflation and energy policy. And the regrettable comeback on that is if we were 10 years further down the track at electrification, we would be much better able to handle it, because as of now, we import all of our oil.
Yeah.
Now, if our transport depended less on oil or not at all, but on electrification, that sort of shock wouldn't impact us the way it could well or might well if the escalation in the Middle East goes down that path.
Yeah, and I do believe it was that oil shock of the 70s that really set countries like the Netherlands and Denmark off, and Norway off on a pathway of electrifying their transport in particular, and encouraging more active transport, cycling, those kinds of things, because they didn't want to be in that position again. As you said, we import all of our oil, and I think our reserve of oil is also not in the country either. It's a reserve somewhere overseas. I believe that was
somewhere.
an Angus Taylor.
Vulnerable.
Yeah, it really is something with a huge potential to really shock the global economy. What other questions do we have? We've probably got time for one more, which is the next question is from Maha Abed, who asks, if Labor loses the next federal election, do you think they would change leadership, or do you think they would persist as they did with Bill Shorten? I'm not sure we've thought that far ahead.
Well, Albanese said today that he wants to be in his present job for a long time yet. That is, he wants to keep winning the elections as Prime Minister. There's a big difference between losing an election as Prime Minister and losing one as opposition leader. The rules of the Labor Party have it that if you lose an election, ipso facto, all positions are vacant. Now, whether Albanese would stick his hand up again or not, would be open to question. I mean, if he hasn't lost his seat and he's still there and still ambitious, and maybe if they lose by just that much rather than that much, he might be tempted to stand again. I mean, Whitlam ran again in 77 after being thrashed in 75. That's a long time ago. I suspect that others would put up their hand and we would get a new Labor leader.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for this week, but thank you everyone for joining us. We really appreciate it. Again, sorry about the technical difficulties that we had in the middle there. We'll be back in a fortnight with the next episode of Unparliamentary, but thank you so much for joining us today, Paul Bongiorno. And thank you all for joining us online. Don't forget you can sign up for future webinars, including Unparliamentary at australiainstitute.org.au. And we've got a new series called Policy School, where each fortnight Australia Institute experts will take you through a policy issue in detail and give you everything you need to know about it and how you might advocate for change if that's something that you're interested in ahead of the next election. You can find all those details on our website, and don't forget to tune in and subscribe to our podcasts. My podcast is Follow the Money. Greg Jericho, our chief economist, has one called Dollars and Cents. And if, like me, you're into the American election, you can tune into our podcast with Dr. Emma Shortis called After America. That one is a cracking listen, so I encourage you to subscribe to that. Thanks very much, everyone. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for joining us. Bye. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy our videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell button to get notified when we publish a new one. See you next time.